In 2024, Christopher Ward turned over almost £30.5 million in sales, with their EBITDA at £4.5 million, close to 15% of sales revenue. EBITDA meaning earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. In other words, their revenue minus operating expenses such as rent and salaries. In 2023, Christopher Ward's sales sat at £16.8 million, and their EBITDA was around £1.1 million. By comparison, their sales increased a whopping 81% from 2023 to 2024, and their EBITDA went up by almost 310% from £1.1 million to £4.5 million, all within the span of 12 months. What makes these figures even more impressive is in 2020, their sales revenue only sat at £10 million, and their EBITDA was only £323,000. By those figures, in 4 years, they've increased their total sales by 3 times and their EBITDA by 15 times, which indicates that Christopher Ward not only sold more watches, but they were able to do so while maintaining a healthy operation performance. Now, to give those numbers some weight, let's do a quick comparison. I don't know the actual numbers because Oris don't release their financial statements publicly, but their estimated turnover in 2024, according to Morgan Stanley's Top 50 Watch Brands report, was 58 million Swiss francs, which is around 53 million pounds. Now remember, this is Oris that we're talking about, a brand founded in 1904, a brand that's a household name when it comes to affordable Swiss luxury timepieces, a brand that's been around for 121 years, founded in Switzerland, the land of watchmaking. On the other hand, Christopher Ward took just 20 years to reach almost 60% of Oris' sales revenue, two brands that are some of the biggest players in the affordable luxury space. So this comparison isn't exactly out of place. Although if you ask me, it doesn't even sound remotely believable, yet here we are. So how did Christopher Ward pull off what was seemingly an impossible task in the watch industry? If you've been following my channel for a while now, you know I'm a big fan of Christopher Ward. I've reviewed their Trident, their Sealander, and their Sandhurst, and I've had nothing but praises for their timepieces. They're really good watches. And while you can say that they are a little bland, overall, there's nothing really to complain about. And recently, I gave into the temptation and finally got myself the Christopher Ward 12, even though I told myself I wouldn't do it. And so that got me thinking, how in the world is Christopher Ward getting all my money? I need to figure it out. The rise of Christopher Ward needs to be addressed. A quick Google search online and you'll find Christopher Ward as popular as ever. What is seemingly a drastic rise in popularity is the result of experience, persistence, and continuous innovation. The thing is, Christopher Ward only became somewhat of a household name amongst enthusiasts in the last 2 to 3 years. Before that, you had to be somewhat addicted to consuming watch content to truly know Christopher Ward. Otherwise, you'd probably think to yourself, what a weird name for a watch brand. My first experience with Christopher Ward started almost a decade ago in 2016. I was a high school student with not much money, but I was looking for an affordable Swiss timepiece that would suit my skinny wrist. There simply weren't as many options back then, but the Christopher Ward Trident was one of them. And this was when they still had their CHR.Ward logo with London printed directly underneath and the textured wavy Seamaster style dial. I didn't enjoy the design very much, but the Swiss made movement in the 38mm was enough to convince me to give it a go. I was a high school student without a credit card, but was saving up all my money from tutoring, so I had the cash for the Trident. However, there was simply no way for me to walk into a brick and mortar to buy one. Besides, the world of e-commerce logistics wasn't so advanced then. If you lived in the more popular countries, sure, but where I lived, there were simply no options for Christopher Ward to ship over. There's no doubt their quality was there from the start, and they were known in the community by the more seasoned collectors, but they weren't exactly popular by any means, and there weren't that many microbrands in the past, so it wasn't really difficult to stand out. And so they were kind of stuck in a place where success seems to be on the horizon, but there's simply too many touch and goes, and it just never seemed like it was going to come. Taking a look into their financial records from 2015, their sales totaled just over £5.9 million, with an EBITDA of $210,000, which means if you compared it to the 2020 numbers, which I went over earlier, shows that in 4 to 5 years, they've increased their sales by only $4 million, but EBITDA only went up by $100,000, which isn't all that impressive considering their sales to EBITDA ratio. But in the next 4 years, from 2020 to 2024, they increased their sales by £21 million, and their EBITDA grew by £4.2 million. So what happened during this 4-year stretch that led to what is seemingly an overnight success? To answer that question, we must go all the way back to the beginning. Before the world of e-commerce made watches accessible at every corner of the internet and the world, consumers bought watches in brick and mortar stores. If you had suggested to someone in the early 2000s to buy a watch online, the idea of spending hundreds, potentially even thousands of dollars over a piece of jewelry they've never even seen or held in person would be an insane proposition. And so in 2004, with their first ever timepiece, the C5 Malvern, equipped with the ETA 2824, Christopher Ward went live to consumers, and it was just for £179. They had their website ready to go for online orders, as that was the only way anyone could buy their watches, which still applies today. They even took out an ad on the independent newspaper, all of which doesn't sound like much, and you've got to remember this was a time when online shopping wasn't the global phenomenon it was today. But of course, there was a major glaring issue. Facebook was in its baby years, there wasn't any YouTube, no Instagram, no Hodinkee or Time and Tide. How in the world did Christopher Ward make themselves known to anyone? One of the earliest adopters of Christopher Ward watches was Dave Malone from Tasmania. Who was Dave, you ask? Nobody in particular, but Dave was a frequent contributor to the then popular watch forum TimeZone. Turns out Dave's friend had seen the C5 Malvern ad on The Independent and had sent it to Dave. With the intention of exposing Christopher Ward, Dave ordered the timepiece and ending up writing a review referring the C5 as the best value mechanical watch the world had ever seen. As it turns out, nothing beats the term best and value in the watch community. And so shortly after the review by Dave from Tasmania, sales started picking up for Christopher Ward. Not only so, but TimeZone started going crazy for Christopher Ward. Everybody was talking about it. It was talked about more than Rolex. At some point, the senior moderator of TimeZone, Hans van Hoogstraten, had to ring up Christopher Ward, more specifically Mike France, to ask them if he was actually paying all these members to promote their watches on TimeZone. Long story short, Hans ended up leaving TimeZone and shortly after that contacted Mike France to create the Christopher Ward Forum. It's an independently ran watch forum that is all done by enthusiasts. Still is today. The Christopher Ward team kept an extremely close eye, not to dismiss any negative feedback, but rather to seek them. They'd religiously check the forum for any improvements they could make, and going so far as to hold annual meetings with the moderators. Reading the forums every day gave Christopher Ward a chance to be proactive in catering to their customers' needs, which was helpful in their steady rise from 2005, and clearly they've been well received from the get-go. But in 2008, Christopher Ward made a daring move that no one saw coming. In 2008, Christopher Ward started their working relationship with Synergies Horlogeres, a Swiss watchmaking company based in Biel, Switzerland, a partnership that would later change the trajectory of both companies. You see, before Christopher Ward, Synergies Horlogeres, led by Jörg Bader Sr., was owned by Fossil Group. At that point, SH had already worked to design and produce watches for Fossil, Fortis, and even the likes of Meister Singer. In 2007, Synergies Horlogeres split up with Fossil, and a year later had found themselves working with Christopher Ward. At the time, Johannes Jank was Synergies Horlogeres' master watchmaker, and had already worked on a number of high-end watches for Lang & Hane in his previous role, a manufacturer of high-end luxury timepieces close to $100,000, one of which Johannes had worked on retailed for 95,000 Swiss francs. Today, Johannes works as the Director of Movement Development for Sellita, the same Sellita that's in hundreds of watch brands and thousands of watches worldwide. So what did Johannes do at Synergies Horlogeres that made him such a prominent figure during his time there? Long story short, he created a series of movements for Christopher Ward that not only showed their commitment to the watch industry, but set up the foundations for success almost 10 years later. Together, Johannes and Christopher Ward experimented with existing ETAs and Sellita movements to create a series of calibers unique to the partnership. In 2011, they came up with the caliber JJ01, a jumping hour complication that meant you could only tell time with a single hand, the C9 jumping hour hand, which founder Mike France highly regards today as it laid the foundations for the Bel Canto. Then came the JJ02, a single pusher chronograph which had been the life project of then 84-year-old French-Swiss watchmaker Jean Philon, a specialist in chronographs. Jean had spent the last 20 years trying to create a single pusher chronograph using a unitask base, but hasn't been successful. Johannes, together with Christopher Ward, bought every single piece of Jean's existing equipment and parts, and then successfully came up with the JJ02. A year later came the JJ03, which powered the C900 world timer, and subsequently the JJ04, which led to their first ever moon phase watch. And in the midst of all of this saw the company's first ever in-house mechanical movement, the SH21. Labeled as the first commercially viable mechanical movement from a British company in over half a century. And it certainly sent a ripple through the community, with reports of a CEO of a large Swiss watch luxury brand approaching Christopher Ward to question the legitimacy of their watchmaking prowess. In other words, who gave Christopher Ward the right to make their own movement? Who does Christopher Ward think they are? On paper, it seemed like Christopher Ward was ruffling the right feathers and drawing a strong spotlight on their rising brand. But in fact, all of this effort didn't exactly bring about the success the team had imagined. The new series of calibers, the in-house movement, and the new releases didn't return the investments made by both Christopher Ward and Synergies. But it certainly laid a foundation that would return sales volumes in leaps and bounds. It just didn't arrive until almost a decade later. In March of 2020, the world entered into its first COVID-19 lockdown. With brick-and-mortar stores across the entire globe closed, that meant consumers weren't spending money in person. Financial reports from McKinsey stated that fine jewelry and watch industry were down 20 to 30%. With traditional brands slow to transition into the digital world of e-commerce, what happens to a brand that's been championing direct selling for the last 16 years? It would appear that Christopher Ward has suddenly found their competition quite literally taken out of the market. Many had flocked to online shopping, and Christopher Ward was founded in that game. And within a few months, Christopher Ward was about to benefit from another byproduct of COVID-19. What happens when people are suddenly confined to their homes for a prolonged period of time? Boredom, lack of novelty, time. Time to take on new fixation. With no real avenues to spend their money, people started buying anything and everything online. E-commerce sales in the US alone in 2020 saw a 134% rise from 2019, from $244.2 billion to $571.21 billion. The watch industry saw a massive boom during the pandemic, one that's never been seen before. With constant waves of new enthusiasts joining the hobby, it meant that demand was on an exponential rise. Many brands and second-hand watch dealers saw this opportunity to profit. And so watches on the secondary market grew to ridiculous prices. Take the popular Rolex Daytona, for example, which rose from approximately $21,000 in 2019 to an insane $53,000 in 2022. It's now starting to come back down, but still nowhere near pre-COVID prices. A luxury online auction marketplace saw a 50% increase in participants, and 2 times more watches were sold to online shoppers compared to 2019. And it wasn't just luxury brands that benefited from the watch boom during the pandemic. Not everyone has thousands, let alone tens of thousands of dollars to drop on Rolexes and what have you not. The watch industry gained a massive amount of fans all across the board, from affordable watches like Timex to Seiko, to affordable Swiss luxury like Longines, Mido, Tag, Christopher Ward, you name it. Fans poured in all across the world. They had nothing to do, and so they started buying up a bunch of timepieces. And when they couldn't afford the Rolexes of the world, they look at more affordable options, and everyone started buying. For Christopher Ward, sales started picking up in 2021, which saw a 30% increase in turnover from 10 to 13 million and an EBITDA jump from 323,000 to 1.1 million in 2021. Things were looking good for Christopher Ward, and it was about to get a whole lot better. Before 2022, many criticisms of Christopher Ward were their designs were simply derivative of popular watches. And this was something that the owners, Christopher Ward, even agreed with, to the extent that they even publicly point this out on their websites. But then the Bel Canto arrived, and in Christopher Ward's own words, it was the watch that changed everything. Or as I like to call it, the watch that shut everyone up for good. Remember Johannes from Synergies Horlogeres? Well, it was Johannes' groundwork with a series of modular constructions that set the stage for the Bel Canto. Specifically, it was the JJ01 jumping hour module. Almost a decade later, Frank Seltzer, now master watchmaker of Christopher Ward, saw an opportunity for the JJ01 as a chiming hour module. Using the same philosophy as storing energy in the JJ01 jumping hour, Frank Seltzer turned it into a chiming watch instead, which led to the creation of the FS01, the Bel Canto movement. And so in late October 2022, Christopher Ward released the first edition of the C1 Bel Canto in Azura Blue, and it sold out immediately. Shortly after that, they released another version, the one in Verde, and that sold out in 2 hours. Then in November of 2023, they did something no one thought would ever be possible. At the Grand Prix de Horlogerie Genève, otherwise known as GPHG, nicknamed the Oscars of watchmaking, Christopher Ward won with the Bel Canto C1, taking home the Petite Aiguille category, which is reserved for watches between 2,000 to 8,000 Swiss francs. In a room filled with some of the biggest names in the industry, IWC, Tudor, Tag, AP, Grand Seiko, Piaget, Arnold & Son, was a brand that started in a chicken shed over 20 years ago. A brand that is now proving that luxury watches should, not can, but should and is affordable. But none of this would have been possible if not for the group of visionaries at the helm, which leads me to my final piece of the puzzle, one that allowed Christopher Ward to become who they are today. The final piece of the puzzle, and arguably the most important factor as to why and how Christopher Ward managed to become who they are today, was who they were 21 years ago. You see, Christopher Ward wasn't just founded by your average watch enthusiast. The trio of Christopher Ward, Mike France, and Peter Ellis were all successful entrepreneurs in the past who conjured up the idea of having their own watch brand on a boat one day. In 2024, co-founders Mike France and Peter Ellis had just sold their children's toy company, Early Learning Center. According to a couple of blog articles, a private equity firm bought Early Learning Center for £62 million, which was previously bought for £20 million in 2001, which makes it close to 200% in profit in sales price alone for the venture capitalist group 3i, as well as the management team led by Mike France. Another article mentions that Early Learning Center at the time was generating around £170 million in sales a year. To provide a bit of context, £62 million in 2004, adjusting for inflation via CPI, is roughly £106 million today, and their sales volume, £170 million, is approximately £209 million in 2025. And of course, Mike France and Peter Ellis wouldn't have possibly taken home every single penny from the sale, but we know for a fact that they were made men. Christopher Ward himself, the third co-founder, well, he made his fortune importing t-shirts into the UK. How successful he ended up being, I'm not exactly sure, as there's not enough information for me to find out. But I'm pretty sure he did pretty well considering his social circle. And so the three friends set out to create a luxury timepiece without the luxury price tag. First step, figuring out the brand name. And for those wondering who in their right mind would name a brand Christopher Ward, well, the other options were Mike France, we'll let that sit for a bit, or Peter Ellis, we'll let that one sit for a bit as well. Now we know why they went with Christopher Ward. Now that the name's set, it was time for them to get acquainted with the watch industry and get a product out. Did the founders know at that point anything particular about the watch industry that would have allowed them to stand out? Not particularly, but because they are successful entrepreneurs, they had the one thing that would have allowed them to be successful in any instance: connections. That, and they had a lot of money as well. In an interview with Esquire, now CEO Mike France recalls a friend, Woody, a Swiss-trained watchmaker whose watchmaking aspirations were cut short with the need to take over his family's textile business in Taiwan. However, Woody had connections, which the trio had benefited heavily from. Together, Mike, Peter, and Chris got to meet some of the biggest names in the watch industry as they were simply friends of Woody's. One example was the CEO of Cartier Asia. And the more they learned from the watch industry from some of the biggest names, they finally found the one thing that they were looking for. This term 3 times is something you hear a lot when it comes to Christopher Ward. It's really become this defining philosophy for them, and it's the business strategy that's gotten them this much success. You've got to realize that the trio weren't your average 20-year-old watch enthusiasts wanting to turn their passion into a business. These 3 individuals were successful entrepreneurs who would have never gone into a venture unless they knew they could capture a certain market share. After all, they've made all their successes in the retail industry. And so after speaking to Woody's connections, what they eventually came to realize was they could access the same components as everyone else in the industry, which meant building a timepiece that was comparable to some of the big names in the market. The same ETA 2824 movement sitting inside a popular household name was now very well within their reach. They could simply package it up in their own way and create the very first Christopher Ward, which ended up being the C5 Malvern. And with that knowledge, alongside the realization that the watch industry has been selling their watches at a markup anywhere between 8 to 9, sometimes even 34 times on the extreme end, they had finally found the one thing that they needed: their markup, the 3 times, only selling their watches 3 times the cost to make them. The mission then became immediately clear: procuring the same luxury components and producing timepieces at an affordable quality to price ratio. Safe to say they've stuck to the model all these years, and the rest, as they say, is simply history. I've been a long fan of Christopher Ward. They have lovely watches, and the quality is just absolutely unbeatable for the price. It doesn't mean that they don't have their downsides. You can say that their designs are sometimes a bit bland or even derivative of other popular watches, but that's part and parcel of being a microbrand, and they're starting to move away from that now, which I really do appreciate. At the end of the day, there's just so much upside to what they're doing that makes me a supporter. It's hard to argue against that. And let's face it, Christopher Ward, excuse the French, sells a crap load of timepieces nowadays. And you'll find the designs anywhere from sports watches or sports divers to integrated sports style watches like the 12, to chronographs, to collaborations with the British Army, so their field watches. You name it, they have it. You want an award-winning Bel Canto C1? Have all of it. And I'll be very honest, I don't think we'll see another brand, at least in a distant future, that has been able to rise from essentially a chicken shed microbrand 20 years ago to now a large-scale global production watch brand. One that can even compete with the likes of Oris, a heritage brand that's been around for at least 120 years. Again, it doesn't sound believable, yet here we are talking about it. And I know some may not agree with this take, but the watch world is a better place because Christopher Ward exists. Think about it. How many of our perceptions of Swiss luxury timepieces, and I mean luxury timepieces, have changed because of the likes of Christopher Ward, who's shown us time and time again, high quality doesn't have to be ridiculously expensive, and ridiculously expensive doesn't always mean high quality. And so I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's taken me a while to put it together with the research, the editing, so on and so forth. But I really do wanted to use this video to give Christopher Ward their props. Again, I'm not getting paid by anyone to do any of this. I just find the brand super interesting. What they've been able to do in a short amount of time is nothing short of exciting, and also just the hard work that they've put into their brand and creating quality watches for everyone to enjoy. The watch industry is a better place because of Christopher Ward, and again, I'm saying that from the bottom of my heart as a watch enthusiast. So thank you all for watching, thank you for indulging me, and I will catch you on the next one.